Good evening, and welcome to this inaugural event for the renewal of the Nevelson Chapel, Louise Nevelson's masterwork, what she called a gift to the universe, located right here in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. A warm welcome to all of you here in person, and a warm welcome to all of you participating by our live stream. You all join this initiative at a time of real promise for restoring and conserving Nevelson's chapel as a gift to the future, and for securing her legacy, her living legacy, in another generation of artists. I hope that you'll help us further the conversation we begin this night. Follow us at Nevelson_chapel on Instagram, and join the conversation too with the hashtag Nevelson Chapel Renewed. I'm Jared Stoller, and I'm honored to serve as a member of the Nevelson Legacy Council and as associate pastor of this remarkable church community. With our friends at Boston Properties, we are the proud custodians of what I still believe is accurate to say is New York City's youngest landmark, completed in 1977 as Citigroup Center. When Louise Nevelson set out to create the environment she would come to call Chapel of the Good Shepherd, she did so knowing it was integral to this innovative investment in New York made by St. Peter's, First National City Bank, and by city planners. At the time, New York City was in crisis and nearing bankruptcy. As a master of environment, keenly aware of surroundings, Nevelson gave this corporate church public center something it needed to succeed: a space of beauty, cloistered from the grit of the city and removed from the incessant grit of commerce. A chapel, to borrow a phrase of Henry James, a chapel such that everyone has need. Religious and non-religious, art lovers or not, bankers, lawyers, office workers, delivery persons, prosperous or homeless, persons of every orientation, every race, every nationality, documented or undocumented. No matter who we are, we all need a place where we can step back and find ourselves, center ourselves, rediscover and be transformed. If people can have some peace while they are there and carry it with them in their memory bank, she said, that will be a great achievement for me. Louise Nevelson gave New York City a great gift in 1977, a gift many people continue to rely on 40 years hence. This is a critical moment of renewal for the Nevelson Chapel. Both the gift of peace she speaks of and the material with which she seeks to engender it is fragile. But tonight I'm filled with hope. Hope because of you, all of us, discovering anew or discovering for the very first time Nevelson's genius. That from the detritus of society, discarded pieces from home and office renovations, toilet seats and baseball bats, the everyday objects of life we so easily disregard, can come the grand, the mysterious, the evocative. Not simply works of art she named, but environments and places and experiences she created to be feast and palace and bicentennial dawn and moon garden and chapel. Tonight we'll begin to explore what the renewal of the Nevelson Chapel and Nevelson's legacy means for us today and into the future. In a panel moderated by Brooke, Kamin, Rapaport, artists Alice Aycock and Shin, we had also hoped we'd be joined by Willie Cole, who suddenly fell ill this night. But this artist panel will consider Nevelson's legacy and its livingness, to borrow her own word, among us today. Emily Sottile will speak to us about the challenges of conserving modernist spaces and the importance of doing so. And Laurie Wilson will walk us through the peak of Nevelson's fame, her subsequent fade from public view, and her resurgence in our own time. Because our time is limited, I point you to the biographical material for each of our panelists printed in your program. It's a real pleasure now to turn to our first speaker, Nevelson's loyal and insightful biographer, Laurie Wilson.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you all for being here. I have 7 minutes to go from high to low to high again. I'll do it, hopefully not too fast. In 1971, there was a cover story on the New York Times Magazine about Nevelson. So she was, by then, already very well known. I'm going to focus more on 73 to 77. In 73, 74, there were 5 museum exhibits in Europe. All large solo exhibits in Brussels, in Stockholm, in Aalborg, in Paris, and Berlin at major museums. At the same time, there were 6, again, solo museum exhibits in the United States, starting at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, going then to Dallas, San Francisco, the High Museum in Atlanta, Kansas City, and Cleveland, the Museum of Fine Arts. So you can see already that this is a major moment for Nevelson. At that same period, there were another 18 solo shows. So in a 3-year period, there were 29 solo shows, which is astonishing for any artist, and certainly for a woman artist in the 70s. I had to throw that in. She had many group shows all over the country and in other parts of the world, but I want to move on to some of the high points you might not know about. The USIA, which was the U.S. Information Agency, sent her to Iran, India, and Japan, where she would have several exhibits in each of those countries, gave lectures, and was very popular with the audiences. She went with Arnie Glimcher, who also gave lectures, and the tales of their trip are quite astonishing. She went to the White House for dinner on a semi-regular basis. In 73 to 77, she had 9 honorary doctorates, not just minor places: Smith, Mount Holyoke, Columbia, NYU, Hebrew Union, and others. There were other major group shows at the Whitney, the 200 Years of American Sculpture, the Smithsonian, the National Gallery. These were all happening in the mid-70s. One of the things that she really liked was that she was on the Best Dressed Woman's list in 77. And that fit with the kind of person she was. You've all, I presume, seen photographs of her and her triple eyelashes and the outfits. She did that partly because she'd been a very beautiful young woman and didn't want to be an unattractive older woman. And she also knew if people looked at her, if they started looking at her, they would then look at her art, and she would be pleased with the results, because the art was the thing that mattered to her. So all of the costuming was to get people to look at the art. This was a time of public art, so she had large pieces. The one at MIT was selected by I.M. Pei, the renowned architect, in 75. Bicentennial Dawn in Philadelphia was commissioned by the government. It was 90 feet wide, and you need to go see it if you haven't, because it's rather astonishing. Sky Tree in San Francisco is a mere 52 feet tall, and it goes through 3 layers of the building. And in the same year, she did the Louise Nevelson Plaza, which is in downtown financial district. And she is the first artist in this city to have a plaza given to her to decorate, and certainly not only first artist, first woman artist. The largest one there is 70 feet high. So she wasn't kidding around when she did these large metal pieces. Then she did in 77, as you know, the Chapel of the Good Shepherd. Atmospheres and Environments. Albee wrote the introduction to it, and it's always known as Albee's catalog, even though I wrote 5 essays. I was not as important as Albee, but whatever. In 1986, she had a big show at the Guggenheim. And then she died in 1988. So she was working right up to a few months before she died. She loved the work. Within 2 or 3 days after she died, her son, who felt he hadn't had enough time with her because she was so busy doing shows and being who she was, took all the work that was in her studio and her homes on Spring Street in a truck up to his barn in Connecticut and locked it up. So it became invisible in that sense. He wanted to keep her close at that point. And at the time that this happened, there were 3 major battles that went on for several years. One was with her assistant, Diana McCowan, and Mike Nevelson, who had taken works that really belonged to Diana. And there was a battle back and forth with Albee jumping in and saying, oh, you should let, and all kinds of semi-legal stuff. There was another battle with Arnie Glimcher, her dealer, who was going to own the work, who was going to sell the work, who had the rights to the work, and that went on for a few years. And finally, there was a battle between Mike Nevelson and the IRS, because he had claimed that she worked for a corporation, a shell corporation called Sculptotech, and that the works really belonged to Sculptotech, and therefore he shouldn't have to pay inheritance taxes. Well, the IRS didn't buy that, and so that was the third battle that was going on in the press. All of these battles made it very difficult for Arnie Glimcher to have a show that would be about the work, as opposed to the gossip about this battle or that battle. So he had fewer and fewer shows, and because Mike had kept so many pieces locked up, her work was not really available to be seen except in collections where it already existed. So for 17 years, her work was essentially off the market and off the radar. Then in 2005, Mike Nevelson sold at auction the estate. And I won't go into details on that, but once that happened, things started moving again. And thanks to Brooke Rapaport, the first big museum exhibit was the Jewish Museum in 2007. But then there was an exhibit in Naples, Florida in 2012. In Rome, the Museo Fondazione Rome was 2013. LACMA in LA had a show in 15. And then this past year, the Moderna Museet in Stockholm had a big show. And San Jose, California had yet again another show. So these are big museum shows, but there have been solo shows in Europe, in Canada, in Switzerland, and Germany and Italy, as well as all over the United States, again, once the estate was sold and things were clear. So, and Pace did at least 8 shows since that time. Now, the other piece, in addition to being visible, her work became increasingly valuable. When you're off the market, prices go down. But in 2015 at Miami Basel, Pace sold 16 black works for prices ranging from $75,000 to $1 million. So you could see things are changing. And last month, a work was sold at Christie's, not such a big white painted work, which was listed at $350,000, sold for $756,000. So you can see that things have really changed for her, and she is on her way back up. And the fact that this chapel is being restored and all the work being done to help Nevelson achieve what she had and will have again, because she's an extraordinary artist, is why you're invited here to help. So that's my story.
Thank you, Laurie. You've told us the sweep of Nevelson's life that helps us see that it's not just simply about ups and downs that happen small scale, but it's the long arc, and you did it with such grace, and we're very thankful both for your presentation tonight and the way in which you've championed Nevelson in writing and in lectures and in presentations your whole professional life, so thank you. Our next speaker will help us explore the needs and principles so readily perceived, I think, in 19th century spaces that are no less critical to modernist spaces now in need of care, including this one. Emily Sottile.
Hi. So this is a really interesting question because the Nevelson Chapel is so incredibly unique as a work of modern ecclesiastical artwork that is site-specific. So many examples of modern art in an ecclesiastical setting have been added to really traditional churches, right, afterwards. And so we experience them in this way that is, they're out of step with the architecture. And so, to kind of step back a little bit, I think it's important to think about the fact that the church is probably the greatest, was the greatest patron of the arts that the world has ever known. And that's not an accident. That is because there's a real understanding that the artwork is about encounter. It's about a divine encounter. And when we think about the beneficiaries of that patronage, in this example, the Nevelson Chapel, it's a really wide and really diverse group. It is the congregation who worships here. It's the people who are working in the skyscraper. It's the arts community generally. But it is also New York, because you have access to this chapel. But also, the first time that I visited the Nevelson Chapel, I was thinking a lot about how New York at the time, Jared mentioned this, that these works were commissioned was this sort of wild and kind of broken. And the idea that art, that prayer, that community are these sort of civilizing forces. And so that this art really has a function. It has a liturgical function, so it's not just decoration, right? It's not just meant to make the place look pretty. It's to invite us into prayer, into contemplation, into that seeking that Nevelson was partaking in, and that all of us get to when we enter into this place that is really very special too for being a living, functioning liturgical space. So it's a very different experience than walking in and into a museum and seeing a piece that's been taken and put on a wall just to be viewed. You were meant to engage with them. So this is really a special thing. A lot of restorations that are dealing with modern art in churches are dealing with removing those pieces to get down to the original intent. So this is a really special experience to go in and spend time with this space that the architecture and the artwork were created with each other, very much knitted together. And you should certainly speak with the conservators who are here to talk about the challenges of the actual materials, because that's one of the things in modernist artwork that you have to kind of contend with. But so in certain ways, this is those issues of the materials are unique to modern art. And in other ways, the restoration of this space is very much like restoration of a 19th century or earlier work, which is that making it happen really depends on the community, the people who use the space day to day, but also the people who use it because it's part of the art landscape, because it's part of our cultural heritage, because it's in our city and it matters to us as the people who it belongs to. It belongs to us, and that's the amazing thing when Laurie was talking about who do these works belong to? These works belong to all of us, and so in certain ways this is unique because it's a modernist work and it's going back to what it was always meant to be. And also it shares with everything else that making it happen, preserving it, getting to see it continue to work, because the artwork's really working, has everything to do with sort of being championed by a community that cares about it and wants to see it continue to do that really important work. And so I think to that point about what that work is, the pastor Ralph Peterson mentioned in a conversation about this, Rabbi Heschel's quote that about this building, our concern is not how to worship in the catacombs, but rather how to remain human in the skyscrapers. And so I think, this interfaith chapel in this place in New York and in this modernist vocabulary is a really very unique opportunity to see that happening.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. And one of the things you said that this space in particular belongs to everyone is something that the community that calls St. Peter's home believes. That's the people who are connected to this place as religious people who are connected to this place because this is their neighborhood center, people who come here for any number of reasons, and all of us. This great gift of Nevelson's is all of ours, so thank you. We turn now to our panel of distinguished working artists, Alice Aycock and Shin, and to Brooke, Kamin, Rapaport, who will moderate as we explore Nevelson's living legacy.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. It's an honor for me to be here with Alice and Jean. They were both featured in our film as part of the Louise Nevelson retrospective that we organized at the Jewish Museum in 2007. So they have been thinking about Nevelson's work for some time, and I know are going to give us great insight. So I think that if Louise Nevelson were here this evening with us, she would undoubtedly be dressed to the nines because that was her habit. For this great occasion of launching the restoration of St. Peter's Chapel, she would have donned fanciful headwear, a couture dress in multi-layers, and then, as Laurie said, her trademark 3 layers of eyelashes, false eyelashes with dark kohl outlining her eyes. She told an interviewer that she doesn't feel dressed without wearing her eyelashes. She said, I don't wear one pair. I glue several pairs together and then put them on. I like it and it's dramatic, so why not? So in her lifetime, Nevelson's outside presence and her work became inseparable. She was a walking sculpture, though much more flamboyant than any wood object she ever created. In her day, especially in New York, Nevelson was such a presence on the New York scene, she rivaled Andy Warhol. But Warhol took the found object, be it soup cans and Brillo boxes, and he celebrated their color and their form and their recognizable graphics. Instead, Nevelson's found objects were pieces of wood that she found on the streets of New York City that she collected. And she transformed those objects, the found wood, with monochromatic paint into powerful layered work. So Nevelson burst onto the scene in 1959 at an exhibition that the Museum of Modern Art held that was organized by the legendary curator Dorothy Miller, and the exhibition was called 16 Americans. That show represented a seismic shift in the art world away from the orthodoxy of abstract expressionism. So 16 Americans featured new members, leading members of a new generation of artists, and that included Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Rauschenberg, and Frank Stella. In 1959, Jasper Johns was 29 years old, Ellsworth Kelly was 36, Rauschenberg was 34, and Frank Stella was just 23 years old. Louise Nevelson was 60 years old, and this exhibition was her debut onto the scene of the New York art world. So that was a symptom of the era that young male artists were taking the lead and taking charge. But I think the power of Nevelson's work, it was an installation called Dawn's Wedding Feast, and I'm telling you about it because it was a white installation that was really a precursor to St. Peter's Church here, to the chapel. So Nevelson told Dorothy Miller in 1959 that she had been working in monochromatic black paint work, and she said immediately that she would make a white show. So she made the momentous change from doing all black work to all white work because of the occasion of that exhibition. So I wanted to give you some background for her realizing the white projects, her white installations, and then we're going to talk with Alice and Jean. They're going to speak for 5 minutes each to tell us about Nevelson's significance to them, and then we'll ask them some questions.
Thank you so much, Brooke. It is a pleasure to be here tonight, and as Brooke says, we have been thinking about Nevelson for some time, and I would say I was a young artist who had encountered one of her sculptures at the Whitney Museum's collection, and it was one of the white chapels. And it was this sculpture that struck me, and its imprint had been so many that I think it starts at different tiers. And the first tier I would mention is the materiality. So she sort of gave me permission to take materials from the street, materials that others thought were worthless, scraps of things that were left behind. And I saw that she saw the potential in them to elevate them as art materials, so that you no longer had to be a sculptor who went to the art supply store, but really life was your material base. And so you could walk around the streets and be inspired and literally take from life as you bring back these works into life. And so I love these encounters that you would see in materiality that happened out there that you would bring in the studio, and then again, like a chapel, bring it back to the people. And I think that kind of gesture of a gift, just there, it's free, it's found, and it's yours for the taking. And that then you share and you're generous and you give it back to the people. I think that kind of shift of materiality is something that really strung so hard with me. And then the second part is the kind of unit. So with her, she would take this, and these parts would become so well organized, this repetition. She couldn't get enough. And I love that because I felt like it was the same thing. Life is generous, There's endless variation of something. And for me, it was the same impulse that, maybe I'm part hoarder like she was, but I love collecting things and love when you see a collection, you see the nuance and you see the variation. You see how one is distinctive from the next. While others would say, oh, it's all the same. And it's like, well, you're not looking carefully because they're never the same. Each one is touched differently. Each one was owned by someone else. And I love that the traces of people, the humanity of these objects in people's lives were there in the work. And so this endlessness and the variation, sort of like chaos within order, were all things in the larger gesture of her work that I gravitated toward. And then one of the last other moments was the scale of her work, because an object scale can't change. If it's a little thing, it's always a little thing. If it's a big thing, it's always a big thing. There's a human scale to these objects that she took. And I think that the shift in scale, that you take a part of something that's quite intimate, handled by a person, then transforming it into the grand scale of architecture. And to me, she was really the forefront of installation art, and she created environments. And I just love that word, that she wasn't just a sculptor, but she created a space in which people would inhabit and walk around. And I feel like we're really, when she created a chapel, really thinking about that space fully. So it's a space that encompasses you, goes beyond the object size, but it is a very human experience nonetheless. So all these layers, I feel like I'm still thinking about her and the lessons she provided me as a young artist. And so the more I think about my work and the strategies that I still continue, I feel like she speaks to me every day.
Well, thank you very much. I think that a number of the things that Jean mentioned, I also relate to as an artist. I encountered Louise's work, it seems to me, in the mid-'60s. And for some reason, I think I saw it first at the Whitney Museum that there was an exhibition of her works. I was just starting to become an artist. I was still in college. And when I saw the work, it was a revelation. It was the architectural scale. It was the fact that these things were, many of them were built in wood. And I was just trying to find my way to figure out how to make things. I mean, I was really struggling with how to make things, how to have a hands-on relationship. Most young women don't work with their dad in the garage. They hang out, at least back then, in the kitchen. And so there I was in the middle of all of this, picking up a saw and trying to figure out how to make something with a jigsaw and a skill saw. And I saw Louise's work. It resonated for me, and it gave me enormous permission. I would also say that at the time, the orthodoxy was minimal art. And so we had Don Judd and Carl Andre and Robert Morris, who later became one of my professors. And I was trying to keep within that orthodoxy and struggling very hard because 1 and 1 might make 2, according to Don Judd, but to me the world was a lot more than that. And with Nevelson, she was breaking out of what I would call the prison house of minimal art. And she was putting, which I was feeling, I felt like I was in prison. And I kept thinking, well, there may not be one universal truth. There are thousands of truths, thousands of fictions, and I'm assailed by these fictions every day. How can I get them into my work? And I looked at Nevelson, and here were these sort of container boxes with all of these little pieces of fragments of possible memories, and I think of them as a memory palace. I think a lot of her work is a memory palace. And so it freed me in so many ways. And I think one of the things for me was there was this orthodoxy. I would almost call it a table of contents. And you follow those rules, and then there were these other people, like Louise Bourgeois, and Eva Hesse, who was making a little resonating in that back then, and Louise. And they were absorbing Cubism, they were absorbing Surrealism, they were absorbing all of those things, but they were adding something else, which was the world of experience. And bringing that in, bringing in memories and experience, and sort of not following the party line. And it was tremendously free for a young woman artist at that time. Now, I didn't think of it as she's a woman and there's her and Don Judd. I just absorbed her, and almost in a very natural way. But what I would say is that Louise gave me permission And she also worked on an architectural scale, which was extraordinarily important to me. And at the same time, the final thing I'd say, and I just want to read a little poem. I was reading a book called The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, and he was really talking about how the world of architecture and the world of homes and spaces is imbued with content, constant fictional content and memory and feeling. And when I look at Louise's work, it's not only architectural, it reminds me, and I sort of found this in my my library, I had to ferret it out, and he has chapters on the cellar and the attic, and he has chapters on chests and wardrobes and drawers. And you know how we keep things in drawers? We all do, and then we pull them out and we find all this stuff inside, and it's a shock. We remember this and that. And I think of Louise's work like that, full of these little memories. And so this poem, I thought, the wardrobe had no keys. No keys had the big wardrobe. Often we used to look at its, in this case, brown and black door, but we'll call it white door. No keys. It was strange. Many a time we dreamed of the mysteries lying dormant between its wooden flanks, and we thought we heard, deep in the gaping lock, a distant sound, a vague and joyful murmur. Thank you.
Alice and Jean, we know about the Rothko Chapel. James Turrell's work is chapel-like. The Astor Gates has made a chapel. And this Chapel of the Good Shepherd. Tell us, if you were to realize a sacred space, how would you do that? And is the Nevelson Chapel here something that you would use in some way in your concept?
Well, for the longest time, I have thought, and I have these sort of suppositions. You can't verify them scientifically, but I think about the cave paintings, and I think about the fact that perhaps before everything, there was the impulse to make art. And what is that impulse? It's the impulse to put something out into the world. Perhaps it's useless. It's because one has to one is in awe of what one doesn't know. One is in awe and in fear as well. But this is deeply within human beings. And I do believe that the urge to make art underlies so much of what we do. And so I think there's a certain irony that some of the most extraordinary art has been made in the service of the gods, whatever gods we want to invoke. And now we are living at a time in which the gods no longer sort of run our lives, let's say. But for me, there is outer space. There's the world beyond the earth that I think about all the time. And it soothes me as well, I have to say. Thinking about the earth, the history of the solar system, the history of the universe, trying to push beyond the everyday. I think that is the urge that underlies all art. I am engaging right now on an absolutely absurdly crazy task, and I'm about to buy 20, 30 acres of land on an island in the Pacific where I am going to make what I call the final piece for the next 15 or 20 years. And I really want to speak to the sky and to the water and to the earth and to silence. And if you want to call that speaking to the gods, the unknown gods, then that's what it's going to be. But so I am going to engage in whatever you want to call that. That last attempt to get beyond the everyday, and I won't call it beyond the secular, but beyond the everyday concerns of the art world and into something else. So there you have it. Okay.
I think we can't wait to see what that's going to look like.
Now I know what I want to do. Can I join you on this island?
Absolutely crazy, by the way.
So thinking about the chapel, and I think the question is really like the power of art and also the power of a space. And so for me, it's key that she worked site-specifically, and it's something that I'm drawn to. So it's speculative until there's a site, right? And in the site are people. What's the community? What's their needs? How does it function for them? And what are their lives and hardships about? And what is the space of empathy about? So the space of care, I feel like that is very specific culturally, but it's also universal. And then I'm thinking in terms of transformation, because as a maker, I take these humble things, they're worthless, and through just the intense thinking and time, over time and process, there's a transformation into something other. And I feel like that's the human transformation we go to when we go to a chapel, is that we believe there's something greater than ourselves, and there's an egoless to the service of art. And as an artist, I'm not driven by my greatest next thing. It's really not about my thing. It's about what can we create together, because I'm part of culture and I'm part of the society. So I think in terms of what can our society contribute that is beautiful in this world that we want to think about. And yes, nature inspires us and it's all around us. Humanity is similar. And I think art should be too, So those are the kinds of things I think that it's somewhere between the self, the other, and something that has always been with us. So somewhere in this chapel, I guess I would think of reminding people of the passage of time, and the wisdoms of the past, as well as thinking about, our future, and that may be the next life or the passing of life, the generations we leave behind, and all of that. So there's so much spirituality, but also science and the physical. So here in Nevelson's chapel, I think about how she leaves these physical things that are actually really fragile. And I love hearing the stories of conservators, because they're talking about the fragility of those materials, the fragility of our life. And yet, the power of the work transcends that. And I'm really hopeful.
Thank you. Thanks, Jean. Before we take your questions, just one more for you both. Tell us what aspect of Louise Nevelson's work you've embraced, and also what aspect of her work you may have rejected.
Well, I know I embraced her work very early on in my career when I was making all the wooden pieces that were sort of architectural and related to the house, and where I really wanted to put something in to make them more than just abstract, formal work. And I embraced it and I also embraced the part of the work where it's not literal. It's a kind of, I guess I would say, it's a generic structure which you don't literally say, oh, that's that, but at the same time you can imagine it transforming itself into numerous things. And so that level of image making that Louise did is very, very important to me. I can't say that I really reject anything about her work. I think it stands for itself. When I heard about all of the work that was left, I thought, oh my God, I have a bunch of decaying wood objects in storage somewhere in West Hampton. Maybe I better pull them out and see if I can fix them. But, but I mean, her productivity, I think, is extraordinary. And I suppose what I really, if I were to say even further, what I embrace and admire is her ability to synthesize the art that came before her and engage it when I'm talking about Cubism and Surrealism, and then to make it her own and then make her own identity as an artist, really make an original breakthrough work that, what I would say, made a tear in the universe. And so, which is what I believe we aspire to do one way or another. And her strength, and her drama, and her being who she was, and embracing all the aspects of being an artist and a beautiful woman. So I like the whole thing. I don't find anything wrong with it.
That's a tricky question. I've already told you guys a lot about what I've embraced and what I celebrate and my connection with her work. So maybe there's a difference is maybe I'm not as dramatic as she might be. I'm myself, which is a little bit soft-spoken, more diplomatic. However, I am as fearless and bold as she is. So don't ever doubt my petite self. Oftentimes when people come to my large-scale installations, they assume a male figure had made this work because it was just big. Therefore, a petite Asian woman could never have been associated by this work. So people shift my gender all the time, so I am very much have gratitude for her being one of the first female sculptors and how strong and powerful she was, and she proved it every single day. So I think to me, she broke so many boundaries for us every day. But in some way, you talked about her outer appearance, aiming it back to her work. I feel like she's broken that mold. I do not go around the world thinking, if I'm here, it goes back to my work. I feel like I am very humbled by the roles of artists that we can serve in many different capacities. So I wear many hats, even though they're not physically on my head. I'm an artist, I'm a mother, I'm a teacher, I'm a, all these other things that, how many countless unpaid jobs I have to do things. And I do it in the most creative and honest way I can. And it does fuel my work and fuels me to go and be the better person I am. And I think that makes my work stronger. But unlike her walking around, in this elaborate costume where she's trying to get attention, I don't think I have that kind of impulse. So I would say that that's probably my difference from Louise Nevelson. So she will forever be the goddess that she deserves to be.
Are there questions that you all have? There is a microphone for Jean, Alice, Laurie, or Emily.
Well, I can ask a question, but that microphone is a bit much. I'll just project. Is that all right? You both talked about your memories of the first time that you saw Nelson's work. I think in your case it was at the Whitney, but I'm curious, given what brings us here tonight, if either of you has a specific memory of your first visit to the chapel upstairs. You can't hear me. I asked if they had a specific memory of visiting the chapel upstairs, just since we're here to talk about that.
Well, I'm sure I visited it over the years, but I visited it most recently about a month ago. I came up specifically to see it because I knew I was going to speak about it. It was very quiet. And what I thought when I was sitting there is that, again, it's a kind of meditative space, but as you go from niche to niche and cabinet to cabinet and piece to piece, for each individual person, you begin to sort of insert your own memories into her memory palace. And for me, that's what one does in the best of, let's call it sacred spaces, as opposed to being told what you should think or do or how you should behave. The sermon, you're sitting there really sort of imagining yourself in these. I think that was me, but I'm sorry, I apologize. My little phone going off, I thought I turned it off. But at any rate, for me, it was sitting there, the quiet time in which you begin to ruminate, and you ruminate on all these mysterious little places, and then you think about the corners of your own life, like one does when one pulls out drawers and all of that. So, yes, okay.
I love that memory. For me, it was I had researched her work, so I'd known about the chapel and seen images, but images are so different from the actual experience of visiting. So many visits in New York where, and the occasion with the recent retrospective, I came back to see it again, and you're always touched by what you notice in the physical space, and it is both in synchronicity with the actual materials, the way it's positioned around the room, giving space for you and the work, and but it's a much more intimate space than you would ever imagine in a photograph, and you do always feel like you're there alone, even when you're not. And you find these seats open for the community, you know. So I think the actual experiential kind of memory is really different from the iconic. And we always think of her as being so iconic in her public works. So that there's a lot of nuances and personal experience when you return to it again and again.
This may just be a dumb question, but I'll try. I grew up thinking of Nevelson as a sculptor, a person who made things that were either put in the middle of the floor, most likely put against the wall. I've been spending time in the last few months in the chapel, and Jean said something that really struck me, which is viewing her as an installation artist. And I'd love for the two of you, and possibly Laurie and Brooke as well, to comment on her role as sort of a bridge between sculptor as a definition of a kind of artist to conceptual installation artist, because she's right in there historically, and it strikes me as an interesting comment, and now you can all tell me that I'm totally wrong.
You're totally right. And in 1967, at the big show at the Whitney, she insisted that they keep using the word environment, that this was an environment. But she had done the first really important environmental work in '58 in Moon Garden +1 at the Grand Central Moderns Gallery. And she had covered the windows with sculpture and made the entire room an environment and wanted people to walk through it in the dark. And the dealer said, that's a liability, we can't do that. So they persuaded her to allow a blue scarf to be put over the secretary's lamp. So there was this kind of a mysterious blue light, and I didn't see it because I wasn't in New York yet, but I've heard from people how extraordinary it was to walk through that exhibit, to be in that in those rooms and feel the environment. She was considered the grandmother of environmental work. Kurt Schwitters had done his work. She claimed she'd never seen it. That may or may not be true, but she was the first person in this country to do an environment, and then she proceeded to do more and more of them, so that when she had her first big show at the Whitney, the solo show, she insisted on that being the way her work would be understood. So you're absolutely right. That was one of her contributions.
I might just add the comment about the installation art, because I saw it as being very fluid and ephemeral, and that's kind of where I associate installation, and that things were moved around. Now, I encountered her work in museums, so they're pretty fixed by registrars, and kind of, so they're located in, quote, the sculpture, the object. But then I've seen installations, and I've done the research where she would just take sortings of this and this when she had another show, when she had like 20 shows in 3 years, right? She would just take all the stuff and ship it over to Venice, and then move them all around and be so spontaneous, just feeling the groove. Like, no, this needs to orient this way. No, this needs to move over here, stacked over there. And I felt like that's what I would be doing, right? But it's just the art history of it and the ownership of it. And then afterwards, when someone went to buy it, she was like, okay, take those through 3, I'll stack it like this, and now it's sculpture. And it goes into someone's collection. So I saw it as a collection, but then when I saw it earlier in these photographs as an installation in an environment that she controlled and moved around whenever she wanted to, and then reconstruct it in another site, that was so much about the living sculpture, not a fixed sculpture as an object. And so I love that really it was part of her life and it was her stuff.
Oh, just real quick to that point, I would encourage you to look to read architecture and the artwork that's attached to it, to read them as connected units, because I do think that we often think about things sort of in that museum setting, but very frequently you learn a lot about the building and why it's there, or the community and why it's there, and what it's doing if you were thinking about those things in relationship to sort of their larger environment. So I would say look to read them.
I'll just add to that, Nevelson often took pieces from one project or installation and use those in another project or installation. So when we were recreating her 1959 Dawn's Wedding Feast for the Jewish Museum exhibition, there were parts of that installation in a 1972 work that were in the Art Institute of Chicago. So she was very fluid despite working in wood as a material. I think we have, Alice, do you want to?
I just wanted to say that I also see installation as site-specific, but as architectural. In other words, the entire space, and for me it's very architectural. The only thing I'd like to add, which is sort of off the subject a little bit, is, and again I'm relating it to the prison house of minimal art, that when she was, the way she made this work has a kind of randomness, the way life is random, and you sort of bits and pieces come and go, and that sort of ordered disorder which is there. It's ordered, but it's disordered at the same time, which really is the way I believe life is. It's not this rigidity. It's, so for me that makes an enormous, that's really the way I sort of go into that work and see it as very innovative. But Schwitter's is another example of that. Okay, sorry.
She was a surrealist, which meant everything was done at the moment with her hands, moving things around until it fit. But she was also very much influenced by Cubism. So that meant there was a structure that she was aiming toward and would keep going until she got there. About the pieces changing, until Arnie Glimcher was in charge of her exhibitions, she moved the boxes around a lot and drove some of the dealers nuts, because they would have a photograph of a wall, someone would want to buy it, and some of the boxes were now gone, they were in another wall. Glimcher figured out, you take a photograph of it, you make drawings so that that wall that she ends up with stays the same. But she felt she had a right to do that, because as she looked at it a year later, or 6 months, or 6 days later, she could move it around as a surrealist would, until it fit. It somehow worked.
We are at the end of our panel time, and this has just been a remarkable evening, and I want to thank our panelists for this very rich conversation. Thank you to all of you participating here. Thank you to those of you who are watching on our live stream. Your commitment to Nevelson makes the time ahead of us in this restoration exciting and filled with tremendous possibility. In the spirit of that excitement, I'm pleased to announce the news of a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, $250,000, which will underwrite the conservation work that will take place over the course of this summer. I'm looking at Terry Carbone, who's the director of that program, sitting just over there, a very special thanks to Terry and the Foundation for acknowledging the importance of this work and its place in New York City's cultural heritage and art history. And they're acknowledging the real leadership of this project's research and techniques in the field of conservation. That's a real gift to us. Thank you, Terry, and thank you to the Luce Foundation. I invite you all, please, to save the date of October 2nd for a reunion conversation with those persons who actually brought the Nevelson Chapel to this space. Among those joining us will be Diana McCowan, Nevelson's longtime assistant. This upcoming special event will also give us opportunity to see the progress made possible by that Luce grant and by all of your support. For information about the restoration and this and other upcoming events, be certain again to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and at nevelsonchapel.org. You'll start to see there a number of posts as we dig into this work. And during the reception, you are invited to visit the Nevelson Chapel. It's upstairs, where phase 1 of the conservation is complete. Our dedicated conservators, Sarah Numberg, and her team will be available to speak to you about their work to consolidate, or I've learned what that word means. It means to glue down layers of paint, saving it from loss, as well as really the cutting-edge techniques they are now starting to use to return the surface to Nevelson's own. Again, thank you all for being with us, and please join us for a reception.